people make a dangerous assumption when they lie to an empath. They assume empathy means gullibility. They assume kindness means blindness. They assume emotional depth somehow weakens perception. But the truth is often the opposite. The very qualities that make an empath compassionate are often the same qualities that make them extraordinarily difficult to deceive. Because empaths are not just listening to language. They're observing patterns. They're reading emotional signals most people overlook. They notice the hesitation before a sentence, the forced smile that arrives a second too late, the shift in tone when certain names are mentioned, the contradiction between what someone says and what their nervous system appears to be communicating. And this is where many people misunderstand intuition. They think intuition is mystical, vague, irrational. But much of what we call intuition is actually pattern recognition operating beneath conscious awareness. An empath may not immediately say you're lying. In fact, often they won't, but they feel something distort, something doesn't align. And that inner signal stays alive even when they try to dismiss it. Psychologists have long understood that human communication is layered. Words carry one message. Behavior often carries another. Emotional congruence or incongruence reveals a third. Empaths are unusually sensitive to incongruence. They can sense when a person's words are trying to outrun their truth. And this creates a problem for the liar, because deception usually relies on managing appearances. It depends on controlling the surface. But empaths don't live only at the surface. They pay attention to what leaks through. A manipulative person may think they've hidden the truth because the story sounds convincing. But the empath is noticing something else entirely. Why did your energy shift when that question came up? Why did your confidence become defensive? Why did your story become over-explained? Why does your apology sound rehearsed instead of felt? These are not random impressions. These are observations. And here's something even deeper. Empaths often understand pain, guilt, fear, and shame because they have studied those emotions in themselves. They recognize emotional signatures because they have lived them. That makes deception harder to disguise in front of someone who knows what internal conflict looks like. This is why people who lie to empaths often become frustrated. They feel seen in ways they didn't consent to. They sense that their performance is not landing the way they expected, and sometimes they mistake this for judgment when really it is perception. Now, this does not mean empaths are never deceived. In fact, many empaths stay in deceptive dynamics far longer than they should, but not because they fail to sense dishonesty, often because they sense it and then override themselves. They rationalize. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe they're just stressed. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe love means giving the benefit of the doubt one more time. And this is one of the great internal battles of the empath. Not detecting truth, trusting what they detect, because many sensitive people have been conditioned to question their own perceptions, especially if they've dealt with gaslighting, manipulation, or environments where truth was constantly distorted. They may sense the lie immediately, then spend months trying to argue themselves out of what they already know. And this is where wisdom enters. Because maturity for an empath is not becoming more suspicious. It is becoming more loyal to reality. It is realizing that if someone's words and behavior consistently conflict, the conflict is the truth. If someone repeatedly creates confusion, confusion is information. If something feels off over and over again, that feeling deserves investigation. This is not paranoia. This is discernment. And discernment is what turns empathy into power. Because empathy without discernment can be exploited. But empathy with discernment becomes nearly impossible to manipulate. And this is where people make their greatest mistake. They think because an empath stays quiet, they don't notice. Because an empath doesn't immediately confront, they don't understand. Because an empath gives grace, they must be unaware. Often the empath sees far more than they reveal. They may be watching, they may be waiting, they may be giving you space to tell the truth voluntarily. Because empaths, at their healthiest, do not rush to accuse. They observe, they verify, they allow reality to expose itself, and reality always exposes itself. Because lies have a structural weakness. They require maintenance. Truth sustains itself. Falsehood requires constant repair. And over time, most deception collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. The empath knows this, even if only intuitively. This is why many empaths appear calm in the presence of dishonesty. Not because they are fooled, but because they understand something profound. Truth does not need to panic. And there is something almost philosophical in this. A lie is not just false information. It is an attempt to impose an artificial reality. And empaths, by their nature, are oriented toward authenticity, toward what is real beneath performance, toward what is emotionally true beneath what is socially convenient. That is why lying to an empath is so destructive, because you are not merely giving false facts. You are violating the very principle they organize human connection around. And they feel that deeply, sometimes before you even finish speaking. So when someone lies to an empath, they often believe they are hiding something. But what they may actually be doing is revealing themselves, revealing their fear, revealing their integrity, revealing the fracture between appearance and character. And eventually, the empath sees that fracture clearly, not because they are psychic, because they are paying attention. That is the power people underestimate. The empath is not reading minds. They are reading patterns, and patterns rarely lie. So if you think deception protects you from being seen, understand this. You may hide facts for a moment. You may delay consequences for a season, but you cannot consistently fake alignment in front of someone trained by life to notice what does not align. And that is why lying to an empath is never as invisible as you think, because the first-person deception exposes is often the deceiver. And that leaves us with something worth remembering. When words and energy conflict, believe the pattern. Truth whispers long before it proves itself. And once deception is sensed, something even more profound begins to unfold, because with an empath, a lie is rarely interpreted as just a false statement. It is experienced as a fracture in the emotional architecture of trust. And most people underestimate what trust actually is. They treat trust like a casual social agreement, a convenience, a default setting in relationships. But to an empath, trust is something much deeper. It is psychological safety. It is the invisible structure that allows vulnerability to exist. It is the unspoken contract that says what is real between us can be honored. And when that contract is broken through deception, the damage is rarely about the content of the lie alone. It is about what the lie means. Because when someone lies to an empath, the wound is not simply you gave me false information. The wound is you made me build emotional reality around something unreal. And that is betrayal. Betrayal is not disagreement. It is not conflict. It is not even necessarily wrongdoing. Betrayal is the collapse of trusted reality. And that hits an empath differently because empaths do not connect superficially. They invest through meaning, through emotional coherence, through felt honesty. So when dishonesty enters that bond, it does not stay at the surface. It echoes through everything the relationship was built on. Suddenly, the empath is not only questioning the lie, they are questioning every moment surrounding it. Was that apology sincere? Was that promise real? Were those words ever true? Was I loved honestly, or was I managed? And this is where one lie becomes psychologically larger than the event itself. Because deception does something dangerous to the mind. It forces retrospective doubt. It causes the past to become unstable. And when the past becomes unstable, the nervous system does not interpret that as minor disappointment. It interprets it as threat. This is why betrayal often feels traumatic, because in many cases, it is. The brain processes relational betrayal in ways remarkably similar to other forms of emotional injury. There is hypervigilance, rumination, cognitive looping, difficulty trusting perception. And for an empath, someone already sensitive to emotional undercurrents, this can cut extraordinarily deep, because what they gave was not casual trust. It was sincere trust. And sincerity, when violated, often becomes pain. Now, here is where many people misjudge the empath completely. They assume the empath is hurt because they are overly emotional, too sensitive, too attached, too idealistic. But that interpretation misses the entire point. The empath is hurt because they took truth seriously, because they believed honesty mattered, because they engaged the relationship as something sacred enough to deserve integrity. And that is not weakness. That is moral seriousness. In fact, one can argue that what makes betrayal painful is precisely what makes trust meaningful. If trust can be broken without consequence, then it never meant much to begin with. And empaths know this instinctively. That is why even so-called small lies often carry enormous weight. Because an empath is rarely measuring the size of the lie. They are measuring what it reveals about character. And this is a distinction many people never understand until it is too late. You think the problem was the hidden message. But the real problem was what hiding it communicated. That you chose control over honesty, image over intimacy, protection of self over protection of truth. And that changes how the empath sees you, maybe permanently, because once deception reveals itself, something shifts. The empath may still care, may still love, may still try to understand, but innocence begins to disappear. And innocence once gone is very hard to restore. This is why repeated lying creates such devastating consequences with empaths. Not because they become angry in dramatic ways, but because they begin withdrawing trust at the level where relationships actually live. And when trust withdraws, connection becomes performance. Conversations become cautious. Vulnerability becomes restricted. Presence becomes guarded. The relationship may appear intact externally, while internally it has already begun collapsing. And often the liar does not even recognize this is happening, because they think betrayal is only visible when someone leaves. Often betrayal becomes visible long before departure. It appears in emotional distance, in silence, in reduced disclosure, in the slow closing of access. Because an empath, once wounded enough, does not always explode. Sometimes they simply stop opening doors. And that may be the greater consequence. Because anger can still be relational. Anger still engages. Silence born from broken trust is something else entirely. It is disengagement. And that is much harder to repair. Now there is a philosophical truth here worth considering. Every lie attempts to control perception, but every act of trust is an offering of reality. And when you betray trust, you are not just distorting perception. You are dishonoring an offering. That is why betrayal carries moral weight. It violates something human beings require to flourish together. And empaths, perhaps more than most, feel this at a profound level, because they do not merely seek connection. They seek congruence, and deception destroys congruence. This is why lying to an empath often produces a consequence the liar never intended. It does not just expose dishonesty. It teaches the empath where not to place their heart again. And once someone learns that lesson, access changes. Forever, sometimes. So if someone trusts you deeply, if they have given you honesty, emotional safety, vulnerability, understand the responsibility inside that. Do not treat their trust as something resilient enough to survive repeated fractures, because trust is not usually destroyed in one dramatic moment. It erodes through accumulated violations, and what erodes slowly often disappears silently. And silence can be the final evidence that betrayal has already done its work. This is why lying to an empath is such a profound mistake. Because what you think is a hidden act may become the very thing that reveals you as unsafe. And once a person sees you as unsafe, persuasion rarely restores what integrity could have preserved. Because trust is not repaired through explanation. It is repaired through truth, consistently, patiently, repeatedly. And many people only understand the value of honesty after they have lost someone who honored it. But by then, the lesson has become consequence. And that leaves us with something worth remembering. A lie does not only break facts, it breaks the reality two people were trying to build. And once reality fractures, rebuilding it costs far more than telling the truth ever would. And after betrayal has been recognized, after the patterns have become undeniable, after trust has been fractured, after the empath has wrestled internally with doubt, forgiveness, rationalization, and painful clarity, something changes. Not dramatically at first, quietly, almost invisibly. And this is where people who have underestimated an empath often make their greatest miscalculation. They assume the empath will keep explaining, keep confronting, keep giving more chances, keep returning to the table to negotiate what should have never required negotiation in the first place. But there comes a point where awareness hardens into decision. And when that happens, the empath's silence becomes one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Because silence in this context is not passive. It is not confusion. It is not surrender. It is resolution. And there is a profound psychological shift inside that moment. Before this point, the empath may have spent enormous energy trying to preserve connection, trying to understand the other person's motives, trying to repair what honesty could have prevented, trying to save the relationship through communication. And this is important to understand. Empaths often do not leave at the first sign of betrayal. They stay far longer than most realize. Not because they are weak, because they believe in restoration, because they tend to see wounds beneath harmful behavior. because they often interpret brokenness before they interpret malice, and because they do not give up easily on what they love. But endurance has limits, and once those limits are reached, the same person who once fought hardest for the connection may become the one who walks away most decisively. This is the part many manipulators never anticipate, because they have mistaken patience for dependency, compassion for tolerance, understanding for permission, and those are dangerous misreadings, because what looked like endless accommodation was often measured grace. And grace, once exhausted, does not always announce its departure. Sometimes it becomes silence. And silence is powerful because it signals something fundamental. The empath is no longer trying to convince you to become honest. They have accepted what you have revealed, and acceptance changes behavior. There is no more arguing, because arguing assumes the other person is open to truth. There is no more over-explaining, because over-explaining often arises when someone still hopes misunderstanding is the problem. There is no more emotional pursuit, because pursuit ends when reality becomes clear. And suddenly the energy that once went outward toward fixing, saving, understanding turns inward, toward boundaries, toward dignity, toward self-respect. And this is where silence stops being absence and becomes authority, because the empath is no longer reacting to deception. They are responding to truth, and truth has simplified everything. Now, psychologically, this is a fascinating shift, because manipulators often rely on emotional engagement. Conflict feeds them. Defensiveness feeds them. Repeated explanations feed them. Your need for closure feeds them. But silence withdraws participation. And when participation is withdrawn, the dynamic begins to collapse. Because many unhealthy relational patterns require your continued emotional involvement to survive. Silence breaks the mechanism. And that is why it feels so powerful. Not because silence is punishment, but because it is non-cooperation with distortion. It is refusal to keep negotiating with what has already been made clear. And there is something deeply philosophical in this. At some point, wisdom is knowing when further dialogue serves truth and when it merely prolongs confusion. That distinction changes lives, because many people believe strength is found in saying more, explaining better, making one final argument that finally forces the other person to understand. But often real strength appears when explanation ends, because you stop needing your reality validated by someone committed to denying it. And that is freedom. This is the awakening many empaths eventually reach. I do not have to keep proving what I know. I do not have to beg honesty from someone choosing deception. I do not have to keep reopening wounds in search of closure from the source of injury. That realization is transformational, because it moves the empath from emotional captivity to psychological sovereignty. And once that happens, their silence unsettles people, because silence removes access. It removes emotional leverage. It removes the familiar script the other person expected to keep playing. And suddenly the person who assumed they held control realizes control depended on the empath continuing to engage. But the empath has stopped participating, and that changes everything. Now let's be clear. This is not silent treatment. This is not manipulation through withdrawal. This is not performative coldness. This is something far more mature. It is discerned disengagement. It is refusing to keep investing life force where integrity no longer exists. And there is dignity in that. There is intelligence in that. There is self-aner in that. Because silence at its highest form is not about punishing another person. It is about no longer abandoning yourself. And for many empaths, that may be the greatest lesson of all, because so often they have been taught to prioritize harmony over truth, understanding over boundaries, compassion over self-protection. And silence becomes the moment those imbalances are corrected, the moment they stop confusing self-sacrifice with love, the moment they stop believing loyalty means enduring repeated betrayal, the moment they recognize peace is sometimes found not in repairing a broken dynamic, but in leaving it. And here is what people often learn too late. When an empath becomes silent, it does not usually mean they have stopped feeling. It often means they have felt enough. Enough confusion, enough dishonesty, enough erosion of trust, enough evidence. And once enough has been reached, silence is not withdrawal from power. It is the expression of it. Because the loudest thing an awakened person can sometimes do is stop participating in what diminishes them. That is what makes this silence so misunderstood and so formidable. It does not demand attention. It removes it. It does not threaten consequences. It becomes one. And often by the time the other person realizes what that silence means, the emotional door has already closed. Because the empath did not leave when they stopped speaking. They began leaving when they stopped believing. Silence was simply the final visible sign. And that leaves us with something worth remembering. When truth has been revealed, silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the most powerful sentence you will ever speak. And this leads to the final mistake people make when they lie to an empath, the most dangerous mistake of all. They assume the empath will never leave. They assume empathy guarantees permanence. That understanding guarantees endless access. That forgiveness guarantees unlimited chances. And this assumption is often built on a profound misunderstanding of what empathy actually is. People confuse empathy with weakness because they only recognize its softness. They see compassion, patience, emotional depth, tolerance. What they fail to recognize is that healthy empathy is not the absence of boundaries. It is compassion governed by awareness. And awareness, when fully awakened, knows when connection has become self-betrayal. This is where the miscalculation happens. Because the person who lies repeatedly often mistakes the empath's willingness to stay as proof they always will. And repetition creates arrogance. They begin believing there will always be one more apology, one more reconciliation, one more opportunity to repair damage after dishonesty. And that belief can become a form of psychological blindness, because they stop recognizing that every lie is not simply an event. It is an erosion, an invisible wearing down of trust, respect, and emotional safety. An erosion is dangerous precisely because it often goes unnoticed until collapse. The empath may still be present physically, still speaking kindly, still behaving with grace, and yet, internally, something fundamental may already be withdrawing. Because departure often begins long before movement. People think relationships end when someone leaves. Often they end when someone stops investing hope. And that distinction matters, because many people are shocked when an empath walks away. They call it sudden, unexpected, out of nowhere. But it was rarely sudden. It was cumulative. The consequence was forming quietly while the warnings were being ignored. And that is the tragedy. Because the liar often mistakes the absence of immediate consequence for the absence of consequence altogether. But delayed consequences are still consequences. Sometimes they are the most irreversible kind. Now here is where this becomes deeply philosophical. To be loved by an empath is not a casual thing. It means being seen with unusual depth. It means being understood in places you may not even understand yourself. It means being granted emotional access many people never receive. And when someone has that kind of access, they often fail to recognize its rarity until they lose it. Because human beings have a tendency to undervalue what is consistently available. Presence becomes assumed, grace becomes expected, loyalty becomes taken for granted, until one day it is gone. And then what seemed ordinary reveals itself as extraordinary. This is often when regret arrives, not when the lie is told, not even when trust first fractures, but when the empath stops returning, when the emotional field they once held disappears, when the understanding they once offered is no longer accessible, when the person who once saw your wounds and loved you anyway is no longer there. And that loss is often far greater than the deceiver imagined, because they did not merely lose a relationship. They lost a rare form of human presence, and rare things are often recognized only in absence. Now, this is where people misunderstand the empath's departure. They imagine walking away is revenge, punishment, retaliation, but mature empaths do not leave to hurt. They leave to preserve what remains of truth within themselves. That distinction is everything, because leaving at its highest level is not rejection. It is refusal to continue participating in what violates integrity, and there is profound strength in that, especially for someone whose nature is to endure. Because for an empath, walking away is often not the first instinct. It may be the hardest decision they make, which is precisely why, once made, it is often final, because it was not impulsive. It was considered, felt, tested internally, reached only after repeated thresholds were crossed. And this is what people fail to understand. When an empath leaves, they are often not reacting to the last lie. They are responding to the full pattern, to everything accumulated, everything tolerated, everything clarified by repetition. And patterns carry more weight than isolated moments, which is why one final apology often, changes nothing. Because the issue was never one incident. It was what the incidents revealed. Character. And once character is understood, perception changes permanently. This is why the greatest mistake is thinking an empath will stay because they care deeply. Sometimes people who care deeply are the very ones who leave most completely when truth is violated, because they understand the cost of remaining where honesty does not live, and they refuse eventually to pay it. Now there is a lesson here far beyond relationships. It is about how we treat what is valuable, because anything repeatedly taken for granted eventually withdraws. Trust withdraws. Respect withdraws. Access withdraws. And sometimes people withdraw, not in anger, in clarity. And clarity is difficult to reverse, because once illusion falls away, it rarely returns. The empath now sees what they once tried not to see, and seeing changes everything. This is why lying to an empath is such a profound error, because the lie is not just risking conflict. It is risking the loss of someone whose presence may have been far more rare than you understood, someone who saw beyond your defenses, someone who offered understanding instead of judgment, someone who may have stood beside you through things others would not have tolerated. And if you lose that through deception, the loss may not be replaceable, because not everyone who enters your life will understand you deeply. Not everyone will offer grace repeatedly. Not everyone will fight to preserve connection. And when you mistake that rarity for something permanent, you may destroy what you assumed could never leave. That is the danger. And it is also the warning. Never interpret patience as permission. Never confuse forgiveness with the absence of limits. Never assume a kind heart has no breaking point. Because the strongest boundaries are often formed by those who have loved the deepest. And once those boundaries close, no amount of regret can always reopen them. Because some lessons do not arrive as advice. They arrive as loss. And loss is a hard teacher, often final, which leaves us with something worth remembering. The greatest mistake is not lying to an empath. It is believing they will stay after they have seen who you become when you lie.